A Silent Witness, Chapter 12. Miss Vine. As I stepped out onto the platform with a valedictory bow to my reverend fellow passenger, my irresolution came to an end, and my duty became clear. I must, in common decency, report myself at once to Thorndyke, seeing that he had been at so much trouble on my account. His card, which he had given me, I had unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, as it turned out, left on the mantelpiece at my lodgings, but I remembered that the address was King's Bench Walk, and assumed that I should have no difficulty in finding the house. Nor had I, for as I entered the Temple by the Tudor Street gate, having overshot my mark on the embankment, I was almost immediately confronted by a fine brick doorway surmounted by a handsome pediment and bearing legibly painted on its jamb, First Pair, Dr. Thorndyke. I ascended the first pair of stairs, which brought me to an open oak door, massive and iron-bound, and a closed inner door, on the brass knocker of which I executed a flourish that would have done credit to a Belgravian footman, whereupon the door opened, and a small man of sedate and clerical aspect regarded me with an air of mild inquiry. "Is Dr. Thorndyke at home?" I asked. "No, sir. He is at the hospital." "Dr. Jervis?" "Is watching a case in the probate court. Perhaps you would like to leave a message or write a note. A message in writing would be preferable." "I don't know that is necessary," said I. "My name is Jardine, and if you tell him that I called, that will probably be enough." The little man gave me a quick, bird-like glance of obviously heightened interest. "If you are Dr. Humphrey Jardine," said he, "I think a few explanatory words would be acceptable. The doctor has been extremely uneasy about you. A short note and an appointment, either here or at the hospital, would be desirable." With this, he stepped back, holding the door invitingly open, and I entered, wondering who the deuce this prim little cathedral dean might be, with his persuasive manners and his quaintly precise forms of speech. He placed a chair for me at the table, and, having furnished me with writing materials, stood a little way off, unobtrusively, examining me as I wrote. I had finished the short letter, closed it up, and addressed it, and was rising to go, when almost automatically I took out my watch and glanced at it. Of course, it had stopped. "Can you tell me the time?" I asked. My acquaintance drew out his own watch and replied deliberately, 17 minutes and 40 seconds past 1. He paused for a moment and then added, "I hope, sir, you have got any water into your watch. I wouldn't want to see that your watch had water in it and had ruined it." "I'm afraid I have," I replied, rather taken aback by the rapidity of the diagnosis. "But I'll just wind it up to make sure." "Oh, don't do that, sir," he exclaimed. "Allow me to examine it before you disturb the movement." He whipped out his pocket watchmaker's eyeglass, which miraculously glued itself to his eye, and having taken a brief glance at the opened watch, produced a minute pocket screwdriver and a sheet of paper, and in the twinkling of an eye, it seemed to me, the paper was covered with the dismembered structures which in their totality formed my timepiece. "It's quite a small matter, sir," was his report, as he rose from his inspection and pocketed his his eyeglass. "Just a speck or two of rust. If you will take my watch for the present, I will have your own in going order by the next time you call." It seemed an odd transaction, but the little man's manner, though quiet, was so decisive that I took his proffered watch, and affixing it to my chain, thanked him for his kindness, and departed, wondering if it was possible that this prim clerical little person could possibly be the tame mechanic of whom Thorndyke had spoken. Traveling in London was comparatively slow in those days, which perhaps was none the worse for a near and pleasant suburb like Hampstead. It had turned 2:30 when I let myself into my lodgings with a rather rusty key and almost literally fell into the arms of Mrs. Blunt. I feared for a moment that she was going to kiss me, but that was a false alarm. What she actually did was to seize both my hands and burst into tears with such violence as to cover me with confusion and cause the servant maid to rise like a domestic and highly inquisitive apparition from the kitchen stairs. I pacified Mrs. Blunt as well as I could, and shook hands heartily with the maid, who thereupon retired, much gratified, to the underworld, whence presently issued an odor suggested of sacrificial rites, not entirely unconnected with fried onions, and accompanied by an agreeable hissing sound. "But wherever have you been all this time?" Mrs. Blunt asked, as she preceded me up the stairs, wiping her eyes. "And why did you send us a line just to say that you were all right?" To this question I made somewhat guarded answer, insofar as the cause of my immersion in the river was concerned. Otherwise, I gave her a fairly correct account of my adventures. "Well, well," was her comment, "I suppose it is all for the best, but I do think those sailors might have put you on shore somewhere. Dear me, what time has it been? I couldn't sleep at night thinking of you, and what Susan and I have eaten between us wouldn't have kept a sparrow alive. And Dr. Thorndyke, too. I'm sure he was very anxious and worried about you, though he is such a quiet, self-contained man that you can't tell what he's thinking of. Lord, what a lot of questions he do ask, to be sure. By the way, how did he come to know that I was missing?" "Why, I told him, of course, when you didn't come home that night, which Susan and me sat up for you until 3 a.m. I thought there must be something wrong, you being so regular in your habits, so next day, the very first thing, I took his card from your mantelpiece, and down I went to the office and told him what had happened. He came up here that evening to see if you had come home, and he's been here every day since to inquire." "Has he really?" "Yes, in a hansom cab every single day, and so has the young lady." "The young lady?" I exclaimed. "What young lady?" Mrs. Blunt regarded me with something of as nearly approaching a wink as can be imagined in association with an elderly female of sedate aspect. "Now," she protested slyly, "as if you didn't know. What young woman, indeed? Why, Miss Vine, to be sure, and a very sweet young lady she is, and talked to me just as simple and friendly as if she'd been an ordinary young woman." "How do you know that she isn't an ordinary young woman?" I asked. Mrs. Blunt was shocked. "Do you suppose, Mr. Jardine, sir," she demanded severely, "that I, who have been a head parlor maid in a county family where my poor husband was a coachman, don't know a real gentleman when I meet one? You surprise me, sir." I apologized hastily and suggested that, as so many kind inquiries had been made, the least I could do was to call and return thanks without delay. "Certainly, sir," Mrs. Blunt agreed, "but not until you have had your lunch. It's a small porterhouse steak," she added alluringly, being evidently suspicious of my intentions. The announcement seconded my appetizing whiff from below, reminded me that I was prodigiously sharp-set, having tasted no food since I had come ashore at Folkestone, and put the grosser physiological needs of the body, for the moment, in the ascendant. But even as I was devouring the steak with voracious gusto, my mind occupied with plans for a strategic descent on the adobe of the fair Sylvia, with speculations on the reception I should get, and the noise of water running into the bath formed a pleasing accompaniment to the final mouthfuls. When I had bathed, shaved, and attired myself in carefully selected garments, I set forth as smart and spruce as the frog that would go wooing and go saving the opera hat, which would have been inappropriate to the occasion. The distance to Sylvia's house was not great, and the pair of long and rapidly moving legs consumed it so to the purpose that it was still quite reasonable calling time when I opened the gate of the Hawthorns and gave a modest pull at the bell. My summons was answered by a rather foolish-looking maid, by whom I was informed that Mrs. Vine was at home. And when I had given her my name, which she seemed disposed to confuse with that of a well-known edible fish, she ushered me down a passage to a room at the back of the house, and opening the door announced me correctly. I was glad to have note, whereupon I assumed an ingratiating smile, and I entered. Now, there is nothing more disconcerting than a total failure of agreement between anticipation and realization. Unconsciously, I had pictured to myself the easy-mannered, genial Sylvia, seated perhaps at an easel or table, working on one of her pictures, and had preceded myself for a reception quite simple, friendly, and unembarrassing. Confidently and entirely at my ease, I walked in through the doorway, and there the pleasant vision faded, leaving me with a smile frozen on my face, staring in consternation at one of the most appalling old women that it has ever been my misfortune to encounter. I am, in general, rather afraid of old women. They are, to my mind, a rather alarming class of creature, but the present specimen exceeded my wildest nightmares. It was not merely that she was seated unnaturally in the exact same center of the room, and that she had sat with unhuman immobility, moving no muscle and uttering no sound as I entered, though that was somewhat of an embarrassment. It was her strange, forbidding appearance that utterly shattered my self-possession and seemed to disturb the very marrow in my bones. She was a most remarkable-looking person, an immense Roman nose, a mop of frizzy gray fringe, and a lofty, surmounting cap or headdress of some kind, suggested that monstrous and unreal bird, the helmeted hornbill, and the bird-like character was heightened by her own eyes, which were small and glittering, and set in the midst of a multitude of radiating wrinkles. To this most alarming person, I made a low bow and dropped my stick, of which the maid had neglected to relieve me, and for which I had found no appropriate receptacle. As I stooped hastily to pick it up, my hat slipped from my grasp, and, urged by the devil that possesses disengaged hats, instantly rolled under a deep ottoman, whence I had to hook it up and out with the handle of my stick. I rose, perspiring with embarrassment, to confront that immovable object, and found the glittering eyes transfixed on me, attentively, but without any sign of expression of human emotion. Haltingly, I essayed to stammer out the explanation of my visit. I have called. Hello, I paused to collect my ideas, and the old lady watched me stonily, without offering any remark. Indeed, no remark was needed on the statement so evidently true. After a brief and hideous silence, I began again. I thought it desirable, and in fact necessary and proper to call, and here my ideas again petered out, and a horrid silence ensued, amidst which I heard a still emotionless voice murmur, "Yes, and you have accordingly called." Exactly, I agreed, grasping eagerly at the slenderest straw of suggestion. I have called to ear. Well, the fact is that my very remarkable absence seemed to call for some explanation, especially as certain inquiries err. At this point, I stopped suddenly with a horrible doubt as to whether I was not saying more than was discreet, and the misgivings intensified by that chilly, calm voice framing the question, inquiries made personally. Now, this was a facer. I seemed to have put my foot in it at the first lead-off. Supposing Sylvia had said nothing about her little visits to Mrs. Blunt, I would never do to give her away to this inquisitional old waxwork. The endeavor was to temporize. Well, I stammered, not exactly made personally to me. By letter, perhaps, the voice suggested in the same, even, impassioned tone. Ever no, not by letter. There was a short, embarrassing pause, and then the old lady, as if summing up the case, said frigidly, not exactly personally, and not by letter. I was so utterly confounded by her judicial manner, her immovable, expressionless face, and hypnotic quality of those glittering eyes, that for the moment I could not think of nothing to say. Don't let me interrupt you, she said, after coming some seconds ago in silence to my part, whereupon I pulled myself together and made a fresh start. I should perhaps have explained that I have been unavoidably absent from home for some time, and that I was unable to communicate with my friends. I have, I'm afraid, caused them some anxiety. It was this that seemed to make it necessary for me to call and give an account of myself. She pondered a while on the statement, if a graven image can be said to ponder, and at length inquired, you spoke of your friends. Are many of them known to me? Well, I replied, I was referring more particularly to your daughter. She continued to regard me fixedly, and after a brief interval rejoined, you are referring to my daughter, but I do not recall the existence of any such person. I think you must be mistaken. It seemed extremely improbable, and I hastened to amend the description. I beg your pardon. I should have said Miss Vine, but perhaps she is not home. You are evidently mistaken, was the paralyzing reply. I am Miss Vine, and I need not add that I am at home. But, I demanded despairingly, is there not another Miss Vine? There is not, she answered. But is it possible that you are referring to Miss Sylvia Vine? Is that so? I replied sulkily that it was, and being somewhat nettled by this unnecessary and rather offensive hair-splitting, offered no further remark. How the conversation would have proceeded after this, I cannot even surmise, but it did not proceed at all, for the embarrassing silence was brought to an end by a very agreeable interruption. The door opened softly, and for one moment Sylvia herself stood framed in the portal. Then, with a little cry, she ran towards me with her hands held out impulsively and the prettiest smile of welcome. So, it really is you, she exclaimed. The silly little goose of a maid has only just told me you were here. I'm glad to see you. When did you graciously please to descend from the clouds? I arrived home this afternoon, and as soon as I got changed, I had lunch and came here to report myself. How nice of you, said Sylvia. I suppose you guessed how anxious we should be. I didn't presume to think that you would actually be anxious about me, I replied, with a furtive eye on the waxworks, though I knew that you had been kind of enough to express an interest in my fate. What a cold-bloodedly polite way to put it, laughed Sylvia. Express an interest, indeed. We were most dreadfully worried about you. to a somewhat friendless man like myself, and sympathetic warmth was very delightful, and my pleasure was not applicably dampened when a chill, emotionless voice affirmed, "The use of the first person singular would, I think, be preferable." Sylvia turned to her aunt, and with mock ferocity, "Well, well," she exclaimed, "you are a dreadful impostor. Mopsy, dear, just listen to her. Dr. Jardine, and if you had only seen what a twitter she was about in the time that went on and no news came." I gasped, and the hair seemed to stir on my scalp. Mopsy! The name was obviously not applied to me. But could it be, was it possible that such a name could be associated with that terrific old lady? It should presume to address the deity as old chap. I could hardly believe my ears. I glanced at her nervously and caught her glittering eye, but the grotesque face was immovable as everlasting granite, though indeed by some ventriloquial magic the word rubbish managed to disengage itself from her person. It isn't rubbish," retorted Sylvia. "It's the plain truth. We were both worried to death about you, and no one wondered. Dr. Thorndyke was very quiet on the matter of fact, but there was no discussing his fear that something dreadful had happened to you, and that there was the advertisement in the papers. Did you see that?" "Oh, it's nothing to grin about. You've given us all a nice fright, and me especially, because, of course, I naturally thought of that ruffian from whom you were rescued in the lane, but he never saw me. You don't know. He may have done. At any rate, you owe us an explanation. So, when the tea comes, you shall give us the true story of your adventures. I hope that you've let Dr. Thorndyke know all about your resurrection." I assured her on this point, and as the goose of a maid now brought in tea, I proceeded to pinch my yarn, as the skipper had expressed it, without those reservations that I had considered necessary in the case of Mrs. Blunt. The old lady, having been unmasked by Sylvia, developed a slight tendency to thaw. She even condescended, in a rigid and effigian fashion, to consume bread and butter, a proceeding that seemed to me very incongruous, as though one should steal into the British Museum in off hours and find seated a statue of not Armstrong, but Amenhotep the Third, in the act of refreshing itself with a sandwich and a glass of beer. But I was less terrified of her now, since I had gathered that the core of the warmth of humanity was somewhere concealed within that grim exterior, and even though her little sparkling eyes were fixed on me immovably, I told my story to the end without flinching. Sylvia listened to my narration with rapt attention. That greatly flattered my vanity and made me feel a little bit like Othello. And when I had finished, she regarded me for a while silently with an air of speculation. "It's a queer affair," she said at length, "and there is a smack of mystery and romance about it that is rather refreshing in these commonplace days. But I don't like it. Adventure and all is very well, but there seems to have been a deliberate attempt to make away with you, unless you think it may have been a piece of silly horseplay that went farther than it was meant to." "That is quite possible," I replied untruthfully, for I didn't want anything of the sort, and only made this evasive answer to avoid raising other and more delicate issues. "I hope that this is the explanation," said Sylvia, "though it sounds rather a lame one. You would know if you had an enemy who might wish to get rid of you. I suppose you don't know any such person? It was a rather awkward question. I didn't want to tell an untruth, but on the other hand, I knew that Thorndyke would not wish to have my affairs discussed while investigations were in progress. So I hedged once more, replying quite truthfully that I was not acquainted with anyone who bore me the slightest ill will. My adventures done with, the talk drifted into other channels and presently came up around to the little crucifix that had been the occasion of Sylvia's disagreeable experience in the lane. In spite of my confusion, I had noticed the first entering the room that the old lady was wearing suspended from her neck a small enameled crucifix, and had instantly identified it, and wondered not a little that she should be thus disporting herself in borrowed ornaments. But when Sylvia had arrived, behold, the original crucifix was hanging on its chain from her neck. From time to time during my recital, my eyes had wandered from one to the other, seeking some difference or variation, but finding none, and at length my inquisitive glances caught the young lady's attention. "I can see, Dr. Jardine," said she, "that you are eaten up with curiosity about the crucifix, and my aunt is wearing one now. Now, I confess, aren't you?" "I am," I admitted. "When I first came in, I naturally thought it was yours. Is it a copy?" "Certainly not," said Miss Vine to the elder. "They are duplicates," Sylvia laughed. "You'd better not talk about copies," said she. "My aunt has only acquired her treasure lately, and she is proud of it as a peacock. Aren't you, dear?" "The sensations of a peacock," replied Miss Vine, "are unknown to me. I am very gratified at possessing the ornament." "Gratified indeed," said Sylvia. "I consider such vanity most unsuitable to a person of your age, but they are very charming, and there is quite a little story attached to them. My father and a cousin of his—" "By marriage," interposed Miss Vine. "You needn't insist on that," said Sylvia, "as if poor old Vitalis were a person to be ashamed of. Well, my father and his cousin were at a Jesuit school in Belgium, at Louvain, in fact, and among the teachers in the school was an Italian Jesuit named Giglioli, now the respected Gigli." "Oli," interposed Miss Vine in a severe voice. "Oli," continued Sylvia, "had formerly been a goldsmith indeed, and the Father Superior, with that keen eye to the main chance, which you may have noticed among professed religious, furnished him with a little workshop and employed him in the making of monstrances, thuribles, and church plates in general. It was he who made these two crucifixes, and with the Father Superior's consent, he gave one to my father and the other to the cousin as parting gifts on their leaving school. As the boys were inseparable friends, the two crucifixes were made absolute duplicates, one of the other, with the single exception that each had the owner's name engraved on the back. When my poor father died, his crucifix became mine, and a short time ago his cousin, who is now getting an old man, took a fancy that he would like the two crucifixes to be together once more, and gave his to my aunt. So here they are, after all these years, under one roof again." As she finished speaking, she detached the crucifix from her neck, and having given it to me to examine, proceeded to remove its fellow from the neck of the elder lady, who not only submitted quite passively, but seemed to be unaware of the transaction, and handed that to me also. I laid them side by side in my palm and compared them, but could not detect the slightest difference between them. They were complete duplicates. Each was a Latin cross with trefold extremities, wrought from a single piece of gold and enriched with Champlevé enamel. The body of the cross was filled with a ground of deep, translucent blue, from which the figure stood out rather low in relief, and the space between each of the trefoils was occupied by a single Greek letter, iota and chi, at the top and bottom respectively, and at the ends of the horizontal arm, alpha and omega. On turning them over, I saw that the back of each bore the engraved inscription carried across the horizontal arm, that on Sylvia's reading, A.M. Robertus, D.G., while the other on the other read, A.M. Vitalis, D.G. They are very charming little things, I said, as I returned them to Sylvia, and it was a pretty idea of the old Jesuit to make them both alike for the two friends. I suppose he didn't make any more of them for his other pupils. What makes you ask that? Demanded Sylvia. I'm thinking of that man in the lane. He must have had some reason for claiming the crucifix as he did, one would think. And these are quite unlike any ordinary commercial jewelry. The suggestion is that the worthy Giglioli was tempted to repeat his success. What do you think? I think, said Miss Vine, that the suggestion is inadmissible. Father Giglioli was an artist, and an artist does not repeat himself. I am inclined to agree with my aunt, said Sylvia. An artist does not care to repeat a design excepting for a definite purpose, as in the case of these duplicates, especially when the thing designed is intended as a gift. To this I gave somewhat qualified assent, though I found the argument far from convincing, and as I had made a very long visitation, especially for the first call, I now rose to depart. I hope I may be allowed to come to see you again, I ventured to say to Miss Vine, and raised a sort of semaphore arm to my extended hand. I see no reason why you should not, she replied judiciously. You seem to be a well-disposed young man, though indiscreet. Good afternoon. I bowed deferentially, and then, to my gratification, was escorted as far as the garden gate by Sylvia, who evidently wished to gather my impressions of her relative, for, as she let me out, she asked with a mischievous smile, What do you think of my aunt, Dr. Jardine? She is rather a terrifying old lady, I replied. Sylvia giggled delightfully. She does look an awful old griffin, doesn't she? But it's all nonsense, you know. She's really a dear old thing, and as soft as butter. Well, I said, she conceals the fact most perfectly. She does. She is a most complete impostor. I'll tell you a secret, Dr. Jardine, Sylvia added in a mysterious whisper as we shook hands over the gate. She trades on her nose. I've told her so. Her nose is her fortune, and she plays it for all it's worth. Goodbye, or rather, au revoir, for you've promised to come and see us again. With a bright little nod, she turned and ran up the garden path, still chuckling softly at her joke, and I wended homewards, very well pleased with the circumstances of my visit, despite the soul-shaking incidents with which it had opened. And that, my friends, is the end of Chapter 12. A Silent Witness, Chapter 13. A Mysterious Stranger. On the following morning, I betook myself to the hospital, intending to call later in the day at Dr. Thorndyke's chambers. But that visit turned out to be unnecessary, for as I ran my eye over the names on the attendance board in the entrance hall, I saw that Thorndyke was in the building, although it was not the day on which he lectured. I found him, as I had expected, in the museum, and was greeted with a hearty grip on the hand and a welcome, the warmth of which gratified me exceedingly. Well, Jardine, I said, or actually, well, Jardine, he said, you've given us all a pretty fine shake-up. I have never been more relieved in my life than I was when my man Polton gave me your note. but you seem to have had another fairly close shave. What a fellow you are, to be sure. You seem to be as tenacious of life as the proverbial cat. So that little archbishop is your man Polton, is he? Yes, and a most remarkable man, Jardine, and simply invaluable to me, though he ought to be in a very different position. But I think he is quite happy with me, especially now that he has got your watch to experiment on. You will see that watch again some day, when he has rated it to half a second. And meanwhile, let us go on into the curator's room and reconstitute your adventures. The curator's room was empty at the moment, empty, that is to say, so far as human denizens were concerned. Otherwise, it was decidedly full. The unusual wilderness of glass jars, sepulchral slate tanks, bones in all stages of preparation, and unfinished specimens being supplemented by that all-pervading, unforgettable order peculiar to a curator's room, compounded of alcohol and mortality, and suggesting a necropolis for deceased dyspomaniacs. Thorndyke seated himself at a well-polished stool by the workbench, and motioning me to another, bade me speak on, which I did in an exhaustive detail, giving him a minute history of my experiences from the time of my parting from Sylvia to the present moment, not omitting my encounter with Mrs. Samway and the clerical gentleman in the train. He listened to my narrative in his unusual silent, attentive fashion, making no comments and asking no questions until I had finished, when he cross-examined me on one or two points of detail. With regard to Mrs. Samway, he asked, did you gather that she was crossing by the Bologna boat? I inferred that she was, but she said nothing on the subject. He nodded and then asked, do I understand that you never saw your assailant at all? I never got the slightest glimpse of him. In fact, I could not say whether the person who had attacked me was a man or a woman, excepting that the obvious strength and the method of attack suggest a man. To this he made no reply, but sat a while absorbed in thought. It was evident that he was deeply interested in the affair, not only on my account, but by reason of the curious problems that offered for solution. Indeed, this next remark was to this effect. It is a most singular case, Jardine, said he. So much of it is perfectly clear, and yet much more is unfathomably a mystery. But just now, the speculative interest is overshadowed by my personal, and I am rather doubtful as to what we ought to do. It almost looks as if you ought to not be at large. I hope so, sir. You don't suggest shutting me up, I exclaimed with a grin. That was in my mind, he answered. You are evidently in considerable danger, and you are not as cautious as you might be. I shall be mighty cautious after this experience, I rejoined, and you have yourself implied that I have 9 lives. Even so, he retorted, you have played away a third of them pretty rapidly. If you are not more careful of the other 6, I shall have to put you somewhere out of harm's way. Do, for goodness sakes, Jardine, keep away from unpopulated places, and see that no stranger gets near enough to have you at a disadvantage. I promised him to keep a constant watch for suspicious strangers, and to avoid all solitary neighbors and ill-lighted thoroughfares, and shortly after this we separated to go our respective ways, he back to the museum and I to the surgical wards. For some time after this, the record of my daily life furnishes nothing but a chronicle of small beer. I had resumed pretty regular attendance at the hospital, setting forth from my lodgings in the morning and returning thither as the late afternoon merged into the evening, taking the necessary exercise in the form of the long walk to and from the hospital, and keeping close indoors at night. It began to look as though my adventures were at an end and life were sitting down to the old familiar jog trot. And yet the beer was not quite so small as it looked. Coming events cast their shadows before them, but often enough those shadows wear a shape of ill-defined and vague, if so creep on unnoticed. Thus it was in these days of apparent inaction, though even then there were certain little happenings at which I looked askance. Such an episode occurred within a few days of my return, and gave me considerable food for thought. I had climbed out onto the yellow bus in Tottenham Court Road, and was seated on top, smoking my pipe, when as we passed the Hampstead Road, I noticed a woman looking into the window of Mr. Robinson, the artist color man. Something familiar or distinctive about the pose of that woman made me glance a second time, and then I think my eyes must have grown more and more round with astonishment as the bus gradually grew out of range, for the woman was undoubtedly Mrs. Samway. It was really a most surprising affair. This good lady seemed to be ubiquitous, to fly hither and thither, and drop from the clouds as if she were the possessor of a magical carpet. Apparent she had not gone to Bologna after all. Or, if she did, her stay on the continent must have been uncommonly short. But if she had not crossed on the boat, what was she doing at Folkestone? It was all very well to say that she had as much right to be in Folkestone as I had. That is true enough, but it was a lame conclusion and no explanation at all. It was my main custom, as I have said, to walk from my lodgings to the hospital, a distance of some 5 miles, but this was practicable only in fine weather. On wet days, I took the train from the Duke of St. Albans and beguiled the snow journey by reading one of the textbooks and observing the manners and customs of my fellow passengers. Such a day was one that followed the reappearance of Mrs. Samway. A persistent drizzle, my morning walk out of question, and sent me reluctant but resigned to seek the shelter of the tram, where, having settled myself with a volume of Gould's Surgical Diagnosis, I began to read to the accompaniment of the monotonous rhythm of the horses' hooves and sleepy jingle of their bells. From time to time I looked up from my book to take a glance at the other occupants of the steamy interior, and on each occasion that I did so, I caught the eye of my opposite neighbor roving over my person as if taking an inventory of my apparel. Whenever he caught my eye, he immediately looked away, but the next time I glanced up, I was sure to find him once more engaged in a leisurely examination of me. There was nothing remarkable in this. People who sit opposite in a public vehicle unconsciously regard one another, as I was doing myself. But when I had met my neighbor's eye a dozen times or more, I began to grow annoyed at his persistent inspection, and finally, shutting up my book, proceeded to retaliate in kind. This seemed to embarrass him considerably. Avoiding my steady gaze, his eyes flitted to and fro, passing restlessly from one part of the vehicle to another, and then it was my medical eye noted a fact that gave me an intrinsic interest to the inspection. The man had what is called a nystagmus, that is, a peculiar oscillatory movement of the eyeball. As his eyes passed quickly from object to object, they did not both come to rest instantaneously, but the right eye stopped with a sort of vertical stagger, as in the bearings were loose. The condition is not very common one, and the one-sided variety is decidedly rare. It is usually associated with some defect of vision or habitual strain of the eye muscles, as in Miner's nystagmus, whence my discovery naturally led to further survey and speculation as to the cause of the condition in the present case. The man was obviously not a minor. His hands, with a cigarette stain, as I noticed on the left middle finger, were much too delicate, and he had not in any way the appearance of a laborer. Then the spasm must be due to the defect of eyesight. Yet he was not nearsighted, for as we passed a church at some distance, I saw him glance out through the doorway at the clock and compare it with his watch. And again I noticed that he took out his watch with his left hand. Then, perhaps, he had a blind eye, or unequal vision, in two eyes. This seems to be most likely the explanation, and I had hardly proposed it to myself when the chance was given for me to verify it. Confused by my persistent examination of him, my unwilling patient suddenly produced a newspaper from his pocket, and, clapping a pair of pince-nez on his nose, began to read. Those pince-nez gave me the required information, for I could see that one glass was strongly convex, while the other was nearly a plane. This question of mine and my friend's eyesight being disposed of, I began to debate the significance of the stain on the left middle finger. Was he left-handed? It did not follow, though it seemed likely. And then I found myself noting the manner in which he held his paper, until, becoming suddenly conscious of the absurdity of the whole affair, I impatiently picked up my book and reverted to the diagnosis of renal calculus. I was becoming, I reflected disparagingly, inquisitive as inquisitive as Thorndyke himself, from whom I seemed to have caught some infection, and impelled me thus to concern myself with the trifling peculiarities of total strangers. The trivial incident would probably have faded from my recollection but for another equally trivial, which occurred a day or two later. I was returning home by the way of Tottenham Court, and had nearly reached the crossing at the north end, when I suddenly remembered that I had come to the last of my notebooks. The shop at which I obtained them was Gower Street. Hard by, as though thought of the books that occurred to me, I turned abruptly and, running across the road, strode quickly down a by-street that led to the shop. As I came into Gower Street, I noticed a small but rapidly augmenting crowd on the pavement, and, elbowing my way through, found at its center a man lying on the ground, writing in the convulsions of an epileptic fit. I proceeded to ward off any well-meant attentions of the unusual excited bystanders, who were pulling open his hands and trying to sit him up, and thrust the corner of a folded newspaper between his teeth to prevent him from biting his tongue. When a constable arrived on the scene, upon which, as the officer bore on his sleeve the badge of St. John's Ambulance Society, I gave him a few directions and began to back out of the crowd. At this moment, I became aware of a pressure behind me and a suspicious fumbling, strongly suggestive of the presence of a pickpocket. Instantly, I turned to him, and I turned right about and directed a searching look at the people behind me, and especially at a bearded, nondescript person who seemed also to be backing out of the crowd. He gave me a quick glance, and as I followed him through the press and then averted his eyes, and he did so as well, I noticed with something of a start that his right eye came to rest with a peculiar, rapid up and down shake. He had, in fact, a right-sided nystagmus. The coincidence naturally struck me with some force. A nystagmus is not, as I have said, a very common condition. One-sided nystagmus is actually a rare one, and of the one-sided instances, only some 50% will affect the right eye. The coincidence was therefore quite a notable one, but had any particular bearing on anything? I don't know. I had a half-formed inclination to follow the man, but he had not actually picked my pocket or done anything overt. and one could hardly follow a person merely because he had happened to suffer from an uncommon nervous affection. The man was now walking on the street briskly, but without manifest hurry, looking straight before him and swinging his stick with something of a flourish. I watched him speculatively as I walked in the same direction, and then suddenly realized that he was carrying his stick in his left hand, and carrying it, too, with the unmistakable ease born of habit. Then he was left-handed, and here was another coincidence, not of a remarkable one in itself, but when he added the other, so singular and striking, and insensibly quickened my pace. I, as my acquaintance, reached the corner of the Euston Road. An omnibus stopped to put down a passenger. It was about to move on when he raised his stick and, following it, stepped on the floorboard and mounted to the roof. I was undecided as to what to do. Should I follow him? And if so, to what purpose? He would certainly notice me if I did and be on his guard, so that I should probably have my trouble for nothing and possibly look a fool into the bargain. And while I was thus standing irresolute on the corner, the omnibus rumbled away westward and decided the question for me. I am not, as the reader may have gathered, a particularly cautious man, or a man given to suspicion, but recent events had made me a good deal more wary and taught me to look with less clarity or less charity on chance fellow creatures, and this left-handed person with the nystagmus occupied my thoughts to no small extent during the next day or two. Was he the man whom I had seen on the train? Apparently not. The latter had been clean-shaven and dressed neatly in the style of a clerk or ordinary city man, whereas the former wore a full beard and was shabby, almost beyond the verge of respectability. As to their respective natures, I could not judge, as I had seen the one man seated and the other man standing, but superficially they were not at all alike, and in all probability they were different persons. But this conclusion was not at all inevitable. When I reflected on this matter, I saw the resemblance and the differences did not balance. The two men resemble one another in qualities that were inherent and unalterable, but they differed in qualities that were superficial and the subject to change. A man cannot assume or cast off nigmitis, but he can have a false beard. A left-handed man may endeavor to conceal his peculiarity, but the superior deftness of his habitually used hand will make itself apparent in spite of his efforts, whereas he can make any alterations to his clothing that he pleases. And thus, reflecting, the suspicion grew more and more strong that the two men might very well have been one in the same person, and that it would be discreet to keep a bright lookout for a left-handed man with a right-sided nygmastosis. During all of this, I had seen nothing of my new friend, Miss Sylvia, but I had no means forgotten her. Without wishing to exaggerate my feelings, I had to say that I had taken a strong liking to that very engaging young lady. She was a pleasant, easy-mannered girl, evidently good-tempered and very frank and simple. A girl, as Mr. Sparkler would have said, with no big-rod nonsense about her. Her tastes ran along a very similar line to my own, and she was clever enough to have acquired an interesting companion. Then it was evident that she liked it, which was in itself an attraction, to say nothing of credit that reflected on her taste, and in a perfectly modest way she had made no secret of the fact. And finally, she was exceptionally good-looking. Now people may say as they will do, that beauty is in only skin deep, which is perfectly untrue, by the way, but even so, one is more concerned with the skins of one's fellow creatures than when the livers of the vermin that are appendices. The contact of persons as the things occurs as their respective surfaces, from which it will be gathered that I was only allowing a decent interval to elapse before representing my visit to the Hawthorns. Indeed, I was beginning to think that a sufficient interval had already passed, and to complicate seriously my call, when my intentions were forestalled by Sylvia herself. Returning from home on the Friday evening, I found at my mantelpiece a short letter from her enclosing a ticket from an exhibition of paintings and a sculpture at a gallery in Lancaster Square, and mentioning incidentally that she proposed to visit the show on the following morning in order to see the works more closely in good light, which seemed such an eminently rational proceeding in these short winter days, and determined instantly to follow her in example and get an advantage of the morning light by myself. I acted out of this decision with such thoroughness that when I arrived at the gallery, I found the attendant in the act of opening the doors at the gallery, and found the attendant in the act of the opening doors, and for nearly half an hour I was the sole possession of the premises. Then by twos and threes other visitors began to struggle and straggle in, and among them Sylvia, looking very fresh and dainty, and obviously pleased to see me. "I am glad you were able to come," she said, as we shook hands. "I thought you would, somehow. It was so much nicer to have someone to talk over the pictures with, isn't it?" "Much more interesting," I agreed. "I have been taking a preliminary look around and have already accumulated quite a lot of profound observations to discharge at you as the occasion offers. Shall we begin by number one?" We began at number one and worked our way methodically, picture by picture, round the room, considering the clerk's work attentively, with earnest discussions and a wealth of commitment. As the morning wore on, visitors arrived in increased numbers until the two large rooms began to be somewhat inconveniently crowded. We had made a complete circuit of the pictures and were about to turn to the sculpture, which occupied the central floor space, when Sylvia touched me on the arm. "Let us sit down for a minute," she said. "I want to speak to you." I led her to one of the large settees that disrupted the floor space with the busts of statues, and somewhat mystified by her serious tone and by a rather agitated manner, which I now noticed for the first time, seated myself at her side. What is it?" I asked. She looked anxiously around the room, and leaning towards me, said in a low tone, "Have you noticed a man who has been keeping near us and listening to our conversation?" "No, I haven't," I replied, "and if I had, I would have given him a hint to keep further on. But there is nothing in it. You know, in the picture galleries, it is very unusual for people to hang about and try to overhear criticisms. This man may be interested in the exhibits." "Yes, I know, but I don't think this person was so much interested in the exhibits. He didn't look at the pictures. He looked at us. I caught his eye several times, reflected in picture glasses, and once or twice I saw him looking most attentively at this crucifix of mine. That was what really disturbed me. I wish now that I hadn't unbuttoned my coat." "So do I. You will have to leave that crucifix at home if it attracts so much undesirable attention. Which is the man? Is he in this room?" "No, I don't see him now. I expect he has gone into the next room." Then let us go there too, and if you will point him out to me, I will pay him back in his own coin. We rose and made our way to the door of the communication, and as we passed into the second room, Sylvia grasped my arm nervously. There he is. Don't let him see us looking at him. He is sitting on a settee at a farther end of the room. It was impossible to make a mistake, since the settee held only a single person, a fairly well-dressed, ordinary-looking man, rather swarthy and foreign in appearance, with a small waxed mustache. He was sitting nearly opposite the entrance of the door and seemed at the moment to be reading over the catalog. The catalog which he held open on his knee, but as he looked up almost at the moment when we entered, I turned my back to him and continued my inspection with the aid of the reflection in a picture glass. He is probably a journalist, I said. You see, he is scribbling some notes on a blank leaves of paper in a notebook in this catalog of his. Probably some of your profound criticisms, which will appear perhaps tomorrow morning, clothed in super technical jargon, in a daily paper. Here I expanded suddenly, for I had only made a rather curious observation. The reflection in the mirror is, as everybody knows, reversed laterally, so that the right hand of a person appears on the left, and vice versa. But in the present case, no reversal seemed to have been taken. The figure in the reflection was writing in his right hand. Obviously, then, the real person was sitting, and writing, was writing with his left. This put a rather different aspect on the affair. Up to the present, I had been disposed to think that Sylvia had been unduly disturbed, for there are plenty of ill-bred bounders to be met in any public place. One will stare at a good-looking girl out of countenance. But now my suppositions were all awake. It is true that they left-handed men are as common as blackberries, but still, can you tell me, Miss Vine, I asked, as we worked our way towards the other end of the room, if this man is at all like the one who frightened you so in Milford Lane? No, he is not. I am sure of that. The man in the lane was a good deal taller and thinner. Well, said I, whoever he is, I want to have a good look at him. And the best plan will be to turn tomorrow's attention to the sepulchre. Shall we go look at the rather remarkable pink bust? That will give our friend a chance or another to stare at you. And if he doesn't take it, I will go and inspect him where he sits. The bust to which I had referred is executed in an exceedingly curious rose-tinted marble, very crystalline and translucent, a material that is suited the soft girlish figures in its subtle and admirably way. It stood on an isolated pedestal quite near the settee on which the suspicious stranger was sitting, and I had hoped that our presence might lure him from his retreat. I don't think, I said, taking up a position with my back to the settee, that I have ever seen a marble quite like this. Have you? No, replied Sylvia. It looks like coarse lump of sugar stained pink. And how very transparent it is. Too transparent for most objects. And she gave a quick and nervous glance at me, and I was aware of the shadow thrown by some person standing behind me. I had our friend's shadow thrown by some person standing by me. Had our friend risen to the bait already? I continued to the conversation in good audible tones. Very awkward these isolated pedestals would be for slovenly artists who scamp and back to and fro from their work and back again. With this remark, I moved around the pedestal as if to examine the back of the bust, and Sylvia followed. The move brought us to the person who had been standing behind me, and sure enough, it was the gentleman from the settee. I continued to talk rather blatantly, I fear, commencing with a cheerful treatment of the hair and the backs of the ears, and meanwhile took an occasional swift glance at the man opposite. He appeared to be gazing in rapt admiration at the bust, but his glance too occasionally wandered, and when it did, the point of fixation, as the occultist would express it, was Sylvia's crucifix, which was still uncovered. Presently I ventured to take a good, steady look at him, and was a few minutes unobserved. His left eye moved, as I could see, quite smoothly and evenly from one point, but the right, at each change of position, gave a little rapid vertical oscillation. Suddenly he became aware of my now undisguised inspection of him, and immediately the oscillation became much more marked, as is often the case with these spasmodic movements. Perhaps he was conscious of the fact at any rate. He turned his head away and then moved off to examine the statuette that stood near the middle of the room. I looked after him, wondering what ought to do. That he was the man whom I had seen on the 2 previous occasions, I had not the slightest doubt, although I was still unable to identify his features or anything about him excepting the negmastis of the left eye in the condition that it brought. But there could be no question that he was the same man, and this variability in his appearance only gave a more sinister significance to the affair, pointing clearly, as it did, to careful and efficient disguise. Evidently he had been, and still was, shadowing me, and was still worse. He seemed to be taking a most undesirable interest in Sylvia, and yet what could I do? My small knowledge of the law suggested that shadowing was not a criminal act unless an unlawful attempt could be proved. As to punching the fellow's head, which was what I felt most inclined to do, that would merely give rise to disagreeable and perhaps dangerous publicity. My lord is pleased to mediate, Sylvia remarked at length, breaking in upon my brown study. I beg your pardon, I exclaimed. The fact is, I was wondering what we would better do next. Do you want to see anything else? I should rather like to see the outside of the building, she answered. The man has made me quite nervous. Then we will go at once, and we won't sign the visitor's book. I led her to the door, and as we rapidly descended the carpeted stairs, I considered once more what it were best to do. I had been alone, and I would have kept our watcher in view and done a little shadowing on my own account, but Sylvia's presence made me uneasy. It was of the first importance that the sinister stranger should not learn where she lived. The only reasonable course seemed to give him the slip, if possible. "What do you make of that man?" Sylvia asked when we were outside the square. "Don't you think he was watching us?" "Yes, I do. And I may say that I have seen him before." She turned a terrified face to me and asked, "You don't think he is the wretch who pushed you into the river?" Now, this was exactly what I did think, but it was not worth while to say so. Accordingly, I temporized. "It is impossible to say. I never saw the man, you know. But I have a reason for thinking that this fellow is keeping a watch on me, and it occurs to me, if he appears still to be following us, I had better put you into a hansom and keep my eye on him until you are well out of sight." "Oh, but I am not going to agree to that," she replied with great decision. "I don't suppose that my presence is much protection to you, but still you are safer while we are together, and I am not going to leave you." This settled the matter. Of course, she was quite right. I was much safer while she was with me, and she refused to go off alone. We must make our escape together. I looked up the square as we turned out towards Charing Cross Road, but could see no sign of our follower, and as we walked on at a good pace, I hoped we might get clear and away. But I was not going to take any chances. Before turning homewards, I decided to walk sharply some distance in an eastwardly direction, and then see if there was any sign of the pursuit. For my previous experiences of this good gentleman led me to suspect that he was by no means without skill and experience in the shadowing art. We walked down to Charing Cross and turned eastward along the north side of the Strand. I had chosen this thoroughfare as offering a good cover to a pursuer who could easily keep out of sight among the crowd of wayfarers who had thronged the pavement, for the first question to be settled was whether we were or were not being shadowed. "Where are we not going now?" Sylvia asked. "We are going up to Bedford Street," I answered. "There is a book shop on the right side of the street where we can loiter unobtrusively and keep a lookout. If we see nobody, we will try for one of the courts off Maiden Lane, where we should be certain to catch anyone who was following. But we will try the bookstall first, because if our friend is in attendance, I shall have a rather neat plan for getting rid of him." We accordingly made our way to the bookstall in Bedford Street and began systematically to look through the second-hand volumes. And as we pored over an open book, we were able to keep an effective watch on the end of the street and the Strand beyond. Our vigil was not a long one. We had been at the stalls less than a minute when Sylvia whispered to me, "Do you see that man looking in the shop on the farther side of the Strand?" "Yes," I replied, "I have noticed him. He has only just arrived, and I fancy he is our man. If he is, he will probably go on into the doorway so as not to keep us to his back, but to be looking upon us." Almost as I spoke, the man moved into the deep doorway, as if to inspect the end of the shop window, and Sylvia exclaimed, "I am sure that is the man. I can see his profile now." There could be no doubt of the man's identity, and at this moment, as if to clinch the matter, he took out a cigarette and lighted it, striking the match with his left hand. "Come along," I said. "We will now try my little plan for getting rid of him. We mustn't seem to hurry." We sauntered up the corner of Maiden Lane, and there stood for a few moments looking about us. Then we strolled across the farther side of Chandos Street, and as soon as we were out of sight of our follower, crossed the road and slipped into the entrance of the civil service stores. Passing quickly through the provision department, we halted at the glazed doors from which we could look out through Bedford Street entrance. "There he is," exclaimed Sylvia, and there he was, sure enough, walking rather quickly up the east side of Bedford Street. "Now," said I, "let us make a bolt for it. This way." We darted out through the china furniture and ironmongery departments, across the whole width of the building, and out of Agar Street entrance, where we immediately crossed into King William Street, turned down Adelaide Street, slot through the alley at St. Martin's Church, and came out opposite the National Portrait Gallery just as a yellow omnibus was about to start. We sprang into the moving vehicle, and as it rumbled away into Charing Cross Road, we kept a sharp watch on the end of King William Street. But there was no sign of the pursuer. We had got rid of him, for the present, at any rate. "Don't you think," said Sylvia, "that he will suspect that we went into the stores?" "I have no doubt he will. That is where we have him. He can't come away and leave the building unsearched. Most probably he is, at this very moment, racing madly up and down the stairs and trying to watch the three entrances at the same time." Sylvia chuckled gleefully. "It has been good fun," she said, "but I am glad we have shaken him off. I think I shall stay indoors for a day or two, and just paint, and I hope you will stay indoors too. And that reminds me that I am out of Hales White. I must call at Robinson's and get a pound tube. Do you mind? It won't delay us more than a few minutes. Now, I would much rather have gone straight home to Hampstead, for our unknown attendant certainly knew the whereabouts of my lodgings, and might follow us when we failed to find us in the stores. Moreover, I had of late given the neighborhood of the artist's colorman's workshop rather a wide berth, having seen Mrs. Samway from far off once or twice thereabouts, and having surmised that she tended to haunt that particular part of Hampstead Street or Hampstead Road, but the fresh supply of flake white seemed to be necessity, so I made no objection, and we accordingly alighted opposite the shop and entered. Nevertheless, while Sylvia was making her purchase, I stood near the glass door and kept a watchful eye on the glass street, not on the glass, but on the purchase. I stood near the glass door and kept a watchful eye on the street. When a tram stopped at a short distance away, I glanced quickly over its passengers, as well as I could, though without observing anyone who might have been our absent friend. But just as it were about to move on, I saw a woman run out of the pavement and enter, and through it I got but an indifferent view of her. I felt an uncomfortable suspicion that the woman was Mrs. Samway. Looking back, I do not quite understand why I had avoided this woman, or why I now looked at the distaste fact at why I had avoided this woman, or why I now looked with distaste on the fact that she was traveling in our direction. She was a pleasant-spoken, intelligent person, and I had no dislike of her, nor any cause for dislike. Perhaps it was the recollection of the offense that she had given Sylvia in this very shop, but a short time since, that made me unwilling to encounter her now in Sylvia's company. At any rate, whatever the course may have been throughout the otherwise pleasant journey, and in spite of an animated and interesting conversation, the thought of Mrs. Samway continually recurred, and this notwithstanding that I kept a constant and unobtrusive lookout for the mysterious spy who might, even now, be hovering in our rear. We alighted from the tram at the Duke of St. Albans and made our way to North End by way of Highgate Ponds. As we crossed the open fields and the heath, I turned at intervals to see if there was the sign of our being followed, but no suspicious-looking person appeared in sight, though on two separate occasions I noticed a woman ahead of us, and walking in much the same direction, turned round and looked our way. There was no reason, however, to suppose that she was looking at us, and in any case she was too far ahead to be recognizable. At last, somewhere in the neighborhood of the Spaniards Road, she finally disappeared, possibly into the hollow beyond, and I saw no more of her. At the gate of Hawthorns, I believed I delivered up the heavy tube of paint, and thus, as it were, formally brought our little outings to an end. And as we shook the hands of Sylvia, treated me to a parting exhortation. "Now, do take care of yourself and keep out of harm's way," she urged. "You are so large, you see," she added with a smile, "and such a very conspicuous object that you ought to take special precautions, and you must come and see us again quite soon. I assure you, my aunt is positively pining for another conversation with you. Why shouldn't you drop in tomorrow and have tea with us?" Now this very idea had already occurred to me, so I hastened to close with the invitation, and then, as she retired on the path with another goodbye and a wave of the hand, I turned away and walked back towards the heath. For some minutes I strode on, across fuzzy hollows, over the little hills, traversed by sunken sandy paths, occupying myself with little thoughts of pleasant, friendly girls whom I had just left, and reflections on the strange events of the morning. Presently I mounted a larger hill, on which was perched a little old-fashioned farmhouse, skirting the woods and the wood fence that enclosed it. I turned to the corner and saw before me, at a distance some 40 yards, a rough rustic seat. On that sat a woman who was sitting, and somehow, when I looked at her and noted the graceful droop of her figure, it was without any feeling of surprise, almost that of realized expectation, that I recognized Mrs. Samway. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 13. Until tomorrow night, I'll see you again at 6 p.m. This has been Indiana Homes. Love to you all, and good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.